The world is not a riddle to be solved, but a wound to be acknowledged. From the first cry to the last breath, existence presses upon the soul with a weight that no joy can balance. The smile of the child, the rush of new love, the pride of accomplishment, each a flickering spark in a furnace built from longing. Desire is the architect of this labyrinth, and suffering is its foundation. One does not suffer because one is broken. One suffers because one exists. The will to live, blind and insatiable, pulses beneath every action. It does not ask, it demands. It conjures illusion after illusion, dressing absence in finery, painting nothingness with colors too vivid to last. The lover dreams of union and finds estrangement. The seeker yearns for truth and meets only mirrors. The worker toils for rest and finds his rest devoured by boredom. What calls itself hope is often only the refusal to see what is. Pleasure is not the antidote to pain, it is its forerunner. In every delight is the seed of its own withering. The taste fades, the flesh decays, the laughter echoes into silence. And in that silence, the will cries again for distraction, for noise, for a new mask to cover the old ache. Thus, the cycle resumes. The animal is trapped by the body, man is trapped by the meaning he projects upon it. One flees hunger, the other flees emptiness, but both are running from a ghost. Modernity promises freedom, but it sells only choice more paths, more noise, more ways to be unfulfilled. One trades time for things, identity for acceptance, truth for comfort. Screens flicker, hearts race, and yet beneath the glow, a quiet dread grows. The soul, forgotten beneath convenience, begins to starve. And so we medicate, consume, achieve, hoping not to be saved, but to be distracted long enough to forget we are dying. But dying is not the tragedy. The tragedy is pretending we are not. In the refusal to see the transience of all things, we bind ourselves to that which must betray us. Every attachment carries its own elegy. What we love, we must one day watch vanisher be the ones to vanish first, leaving our love to rot unattended. In this, there is no injustice. The world owes nothing, and gives only what it must take back. To renounce is not to deny life, it is to see it clearly. To turn from desire is not to embrace nihilism, but to step into the stillness beyond illusion. The ascetic does not hate the world. He simply ceases to be seduced by it. He does not run from pain, but walks into it, until pain becomes transparent and reveals the silence beneath. That silence is not peace in the worldly sensate, is peace beyond the world. What modern man calls peace is often merely the absence of stimulus, a temporary pause in the cacophony of craving. But true peace, the kind born from surrender, comes not by addition, but by subtraction. Not through attainment, but through relinquishment. The more one desires, the more one suffers. The less one clings, the freer one becomes. Not in the language of conquest, but in the quiet of vanishing. And so the path of asceticism does not promise happiness. It promises clarity. To walk it is to die before dying, to let go before life lets go of you. It is not a heroic journey, but a sobering retreat from the endless theater of ego. The self, that flickering chimera we defend so fiercely, dissolves like mist when seen without indulgence. And in its absence, a strange light appears not, a light of joy, but of lucidity. All that we call progress is the movement of the will under another disguise. It invents mechanisms, adorns cities, stretches lifespans, but it does not quiet the hunger. Civilization builds monuments to its own restlessness, dressing despair in marble and metal. It is not man who evolves, but his distractions that grow more elaborate. The wheel turns faster, but the destination does not change. Still he seeks, still he yearns, still he suffers. The body ages, and still the will burns, unappeased. It does not learn. It does not relent. A child weeps for the toy he cannot have. A king weeps for the empire he cannot hold. The scale changes, but the structure remains. Desire is not the path to freedom, it is the chain. And the one who fulfills every wish is not free, but only more deeply entangled in the web of expectation, fear, and decay. Even pleasure becomes painful once its absence is feared. Every gain carries the shadow of its loss. The lover, drunk on union, already feels the tremble of parting. The artist, proud of his creation, is haunted by the silence that follows. No joy stands alone. It is yoked to time, impermanence, and the slow erosion of meaning. The will cannot rest, because it is not meant to rest. Its only end is exhaustion. Religion offers paradise, but only to the obedient sufferer. Society offers status, but only to the performative self. Love offers closeness, but only through the trembling filter of ego. There is no sanctuary within the world that does not exact a price. Even the most tender embrace carries within it the ache of mortality, the slow leaking away of time. What is sweet now must become bitter. That is the law of appearances. Detachment is not an act of cruelty. It is a form of honesty. To step back is not to abandon, but to see. The lover who clings cannot love freely. The thinker who argues cannot think clearly. The self that insists on its own permanence becomes blind to the flow of being. Only in letting go does one glimpse the quiet beneath the noise, the still space where nothing is asked and nothing is taken. The ascetic does not despise the world. He sees through it. He lives among things, but not for them. He partakes, but does not depend. His hands are open not to grasp, but to release. In his gaze, desire withers, not from disdain but from disuse. He does not escape life, but steps outside the carnival of its compulsions. And in doing so, he finds not elation, but weightlessness. The face of suffering is not always contorted. It is often smiling. In the pursuit of status, in the hunger for affirmation, in the endless search for the self in others, we suffer in disguise. We call it ambition, passion, growth. But beneath it all lies the trembling fear of being nothing, of vanishing, unacknowledged, unloved. This is the root illusion, that the self is a substance, and not a shadow. Yet even the shadow has its grace. In suffering, we are forced to confront the truth that no illusion can protect us forever. We are not here to conquer, but to see, not to acquire, but to surrender. Each sorrow peels away a mask. Each failure is a soft hand guiding us towards stillness. The world breaks us, not to punish, but to show us we were clinging to glass. There is no salvation in becoming more only and needing less. The hunger of the will is not cured by feeding it, but by understanding its nature. It does not seek the object, but the movement. It does not want peace, it wants wanting. And so peace becomes possible only when the will is quieted, not gratified. This is not defeat, but deliverance. The path is not upward, but inward. Not toward light, but toward silence. What one finds there is not a treasure, but an absence. Not a crown, but an empty room. And in that emptiness, the self dissolves like smoke in a windless sky. No applause, no triumphantly, the still recognition that nothing was ever missing, because nothing was ever truly possessed. What is called meaning is often only repetition in disguise pattern mistaken for purpose. The man who wakes, labors, eats and sleeps, who loves and loses, who climbs and falls, believes himself to be progressing. But the circle does not break. It spins silently beneath the illusion of novelty. A new face, a new place, a new goal, yet always the same hunger driving the hand, the same dread pacing in the marrow. Nothing is gained, only exchanged. The child who dreams of being older becomes the adult who longs for youth. The worker who seeks rest finds boredom. The one who escapes loneliness enters the prison of obligation. Each desire fulfilled leaves behind the ash of its promise. Not because the world is cruel, but because the will itself is a mirage cannot be satisfied, only exhausted. And in that exhaustion, the soul turns quietly toward questions too large for language. What is this self I protect so fiercely? What is this world I cling to? Not what I see, but that which sees what remains when all masks fall away, when silence answers every prayer. There, in that hushed awareness, the ego loosens its grip. Not by choice, but by necessity. For the cost of maintaining illusion becomes greater than the fear of its loss. Pain does not lie. It strips away the ornamental and leaves only the essential. In suffering, one no longer asks, "What can I have?" but, "What is real?" The noise fades, the ambitions dissolve. The self becomes porous, and what flows through is not answer, but spaciousness that neither affirms nor denies, but simply is, the presence behind all passing. The modern world recoils from this stillness. It peddles noise as clarity, urgency as importance. Identity is worn like armor, and beneath it, the body starves. Be someone, it says, never noticing that the effort to be someone is the source of our deepest fatigue. For who can rest when being must constantly be proven? When worth is measured in attention, and attention is a currency always in debt. Even love, the most tender of illusions, is often just the will seeking reflection. See me, it cries. Make me real. But no eye can grant what lies beyond appearance. No embrace can anchor the self that never holds still. The one who seeks completion in another is not in love, but in fear. And so even intimacy becomes performance, each fearing the silence where nothing can be affirmed, where truth whispers without form. True detachment is not coldness. It is the end of performance, the end of needing to be anything other than what silently is. It is not retreat from the world, but seeing the world as it truly is, transitory, uncertain, unable to confer the solidity we crave. One does not withdraw in anger, but in sorrow, the sorrow of one who has seen through the carnival, and knows that no mask, no dance, no prize can undo the void beneath. But this void is not an enemy. It is the only honest thing. In it, the burden of becoming is lifted. The need to explain, to justify, to matter all, falls away. And what remains is not despair, but a calm too vast to name. A peace that arises not from the world's consent, but from the death of expectation. The flame no longer seeks to burn higher. It simply flickers, quiet and free. Even the body, once clung to so fiercely, becomes translucent. One watches it age, not with panic, but with reverence. The wrinkles are not signs of loss, but the body's poetry lines written by time, not as punishment, but as reminder. This too shall pass. This too was never mine. And in the fading of flesh, the ego trembles, but the soul exhales. For to die is not a tragedy, but a return to the unborn silence from which all things emerge. And he who dies before he dies, the ascetic, the seer, walks this earth not as a prisoner, but as a ghost already released. He smiles, not from joy, but from freedom. He speaks, not to persuade, but to echo the truth that cannot be taught, that all suffering is the will's reflection, and all peace is the will's absence. The agony of time is not its passing, but its insistence. Every second presses forward like a blade, reminding us that nothing remains, no moment, no feeling, no self. We speak of memories as possessions, but they are phantoms, stitched together by the will to believe we are someone coherent, someone continuous. Yet in truth, the self is a flickering procession, a ghost wearing its own mask, chasing its own echo through a corridor without end. Time devours not only youth and beauty, but meaning itself. What once stirred the heart becomes hollow, not by betrayal, but by duration. The book that once inspired becomes merely familiar. The face once adored grows silent in the mind. Even grief, when left to time, does not resolve, it erodes. And what is left behind is not healing, but numbness mistaken for peace. The world does not curate, forgets, and we, its passengers, are slowly dissolved in the forgetting. The culture of progress is the cult of becoming, always more, always ahead, a false future stretched over a present that is never enough. It promises that if one suffers now, joy will follow. If one conforms, one will be seen. If one accumulates, one will be safe. But the reward never arrives. It only moves forward like a mirage, invisible, unreachable, cruel in its precision. The worker dies with tasks unfinished. The lover dies with words unsaid. The thinker dies with ideas unborn. No one departs complete, for completeness was never offered. Even the most celebrated life fades into anonymity. Names carved into stone are read by strangers, if at all. And fame itself is a spectacle of misunderstanding, the self reduced to a symbol, emptied of intimacy. No applause can fill the silence that returns when the stage dims. To seek meaning in legacy is to gamble one's soul against the tide of oblivion, and oblivion, patient and indifferent, always wins. But in this void, something strange begins to awaken. Not hope, not light, but a stillness that no longer resists, a consciousness that no longer seeks definition. It watches the mind as one watches clouds. Thoughts pass, emotions rise, the will twitches. And yet, there is no anchor, no clinging, just awareness, quiet, immense, impersonal. A mirror without judgment. Detachment is often mistaken for despair, but it is a kind of mercy. When one ceases to demand from life what it cannot give, suffering loses its sting. Not because pain disappears, but because it is no longer resisted. One weeps without narrative. One aches without rebellion. Suffering becomes a kind of weather passing, impersonal, untouched by the noise of identity. This is not numbness, it is openness. The ego howls in this openness. It wants walls, it wants mirrors, it wants someone to be. But the soul, when left uncoiled, does not require a name. It does not require story. It exists like a wind in the dark felt, but not possessed. And in this, there is an austere kind of freedom. Not freedom to do or to have, but freedom from becoming. What does one become in the absence of desire? Not enlightened, not wise, simply empty. And this emptiness is not lack, it is the space in which illusion dissolves. The space where one can finally stop performing, stop defending, stop running. In that stillness, the boundaries of the self begin to thin. Not into some grand unity, not into cosmic fusion, but into a quiet knowing that nothing ever truly separated in the first place. Asceticism is not an act of will, but the relinquishment of will. The hunger is seen, not fed. The urge to define is observed, not followed. The world continues, but the self steps aside. This is not selflessness in the moral sense. It is self-transparency, recognition that the self, as clung to, is a construct maintained by suffering. Once the fuel of desire is withdrawn, the fire dies quietly. This death is not tragic. It is the return of clarity. Like waking from a fever dream, the soul sees again not what it wishes, but what is. The trees do not speak, the stars do not care, the heart beats because it must, and that is enough. The silence is not void, it is rest. Not the rest of sleep, but of ceasing to become. There is no one left to impress, no future left to earn, no self left to maintain. Just this breath, and then perhaps another. What remains when the fire burns down to ash is not emptiness, but essence. The glow that once flickered with ambition, with lust, with narrative, all the heaving breath of a world obsessed with movement into something still, not lifeless, but beyond the fever of living. A quiet so pure it can no longer carry the weight of wanting, not a silence that waits, but a silence that is. And within it, the illusions that once towered over us become frail. The image of the lover, once crowned in longing, returns to the dust of memory. The dreams of status, like old garments, fall from the body of the soul. Even morality, the scaffold of civilized yearning, begins to flicker. Not because the good loses its worth, but because the categories dissolve. Suffering reveals that virtue born of fear is not virtue, and the will to do good is often only the will to escape guilt. One begins to see that most actions, even the noble ones, are transactions with the void, bargains struck with meaninglessness in the hope of temporary reprieve. But the void accepts no contracts. It watches, silent, as all efforts collapse inward. Even transcendence, when pursued, becomes a vanity. To seek liberation is to still believe there is something to gain. The ascetic does not seek a stop seeking. And in that stillness, the face of the world changes. Not in appearance, but in resonance. The tree no longer symbolizes life, it simply stands. The sky no longer evokes eternity, it simply exists. There is no allegory, no sacred metaphor. Things cease to point elsewhere, and begin, finally, to be themselves. This is the death of interpretation. Not cynicism, but the end of the mind's compulsion to cloak the world in meaning. Here, beauty no longer intoxicates its wounds, not with seduction, but with fragility. One sees the flower bloom and already feels the ache of its falling. One hears the wind and knows it will never speak again in quite that way. This is not sentimentality, it is the ache of impermanence perceived without defense. The recognition that everything we touch is already vanishing. And yet, in this vanishing, there is no despair, only tenderness. The tenderness of knowing that nothing belongs to us, not even our sorrow. We do not own our stories. We do not author our endings. Even grief, that last possession of the ego, does not stay. It too fades. The one who suffers becomes a memory, and the memory dissolves into silence. Freedom, as the world defines it, is the power to choose. But this is merely the freedom to remain ensnared by will. True freedom arises only when choice itself is relinquished. Not in paralysis, but in release. The ascetic does not ask, "What should I do?" but instead listens for the silence beyond action. He lets the world move as it must, while he watches, not detached out of arrogance, but because he has seen enough to know that nothing can be held. The self, once imagined as central, becomes peripheral, and then translucent, and finally irrelevant. What remains is not absence, but transparency. The light no longer shines on the self, but through it. And in that transparency, something deeper is perceived, not a being, not a truth, but a still pulse, like breath without lungs, the hum of what is before name, before thought, before fear. To live in this state is not to abandon the world, but to walk through it without demand. One eats without hunger, speaks without assertion, touches without need. The body moves, the seasons turn, and the soul remains seated in the quiet that does not begin or end. No longer pulled toward future or past, no longer inflated by identity or crushed by its loss. Just the bare reality of presence, without ornament. And the final illusion fades, the belief that we are here for something, that this life holds a secret just beyond reach. But there is no secret, there is only what is, and what is has never concealed itself. It is our wanting that turns simplicity into enigma. The truth is plain, but we are too complex to see it, until we are not. Until complexity dies, and with it, the one who demanded that life mean more than it does. The ascetic does not escape life. He lets it end in him while he still breathes, and in that ending he finds not fulfillment, but cessation. The cessation of the story, the cessation of resistance, the cessation of self. No reward, no light, no cosmic applause, only the soft silence of what has ceased to need. There comes a point when even the language of renunciation begins to rot in the mouth. Words, once scaffolds for insight, turn to dust as the truth beneath them refuses translation. Philosophy, doctrine, poetry all attempts to shape the formless. But the formless does not ask to be shaped. It waits patiently, beyond speech, until the speaker tires of hearing his own voice. Even thought, which once held the illusion of mastery, becomes a weight. The mind circles its own decay, weaving interpretations like a spider spinning webs in a burnt forest. Insight becomes repetition. Reflection becomes inertia. The seeker, having scaled every abstraction, stands at the edge of a great silence, where the last thought dies, not with a scream but with a sigh. Here, one does not find truth. One loses the need to find. The curtain does not rise. It falls. And what remains behind it is not revelation, but disappearance. Not enlightenment, but absence. The self, once swollen with questions, dissolves into the very air it once tried to conquer. And this, finally, is peace, not the arrival of something new, but the vanishing of everything unnecessary. The body remains, a fragile husk moving through a world no longer possessed. Hunger still comes, but it no longer commands. Emotion still stirs, but it no longer dictates. The soul, having relinquished its thirst, now drinks from a well that asks for nothing in return, and the water is bitter, but clear. One looks upon the world now with a gaze emptied of ambition, not passive, but disarmed. The sky no longer reflects, mood it simply is. The tree no longer suggests growth or endurance, it simply stands, without metaphor. And in this stark seeing, compassion is born not as a virtue, but as a quiet trembling before the shared sorrow of all things that suffer under the weight of becoming. There is no sermon to be given here, no lesson to pass on. The one who knows this stillness has nothing left to teach, for there is no longer a student, no longer a path. The finger pointing at the moon has fallen away, and the moon itself is just a stone reflecting borrowed light. What we call the sacred is not a place, not a presents it, is the absence of the profane, the silence where noise has died, the space where the will no longer claws. That which remains when all that is not essential has burned away, a kind of negative holiness, a sanctity born not of divine visitation, but of human retreat. In this retreat, one does not gain purity. One sheds contamination, the contamination of hope, of fear, of narrative. Even the soul is not preserved, it too is let go. That most cherished illusion, the seat of meaning, is unmasked as yet another mask, and beneath it, nothing. Not a void to be feared, but a quiet so deep it does not care whether it is noticed. Some will say this is nihilism, but they have not tasted the calm that comes when needing ceases. This is not despair, it is its grave. For despair is the child of hope betrayed, and here hope no longer breeds. There is no betrayal, because there is no promise. No deception, because there is no desire. And so the world becomes soft, not easier, but less personal. Suffering still passes through, but it no longer defines. Death still comes, but it no longer threatens. Even joy, when it arises, is not clutched, it is allowed, like a bird resting briefly before flying on. Nothing stays. Nothing must. This is the final form of asceticism, to abide in the world while no longer belonging to it, to wear the face of a man, but not to believe it, To speak, but not to need to be heard. To walk, but not to arrive. There is no longer an endpoint. Only this, and this, and this, each moment arising without claim, without continuity. And so it ends. Not with climax, but with vanishing. Not with revelation, but with release. The thread that once seemed so tangled, so urgent in its weaving, quietly unravels, and what is left in the hand is not fabric, but space. The self, the sufferer, the seek-reach dissolves like footprints in water. No triumph, no fall, just the slow ceasing of the need to become. There is no destination, only the fading of the compulsion to arrive. The one who once ran from sorrow, from silence, from stillness, now sits without movement. Not because he has conquered himself, but because he has ceased to mistake himself for something to be conquered. He no longer fears the dark, for he no longer believes in the light. He abides because there is nothing left to chase. In the quiet that remains, a strange tenderness lingers. Not love as possession or passion, but as a resting present sun-adorned, unmoved. A gaze that sees everything, claims nothing. Even beauty, that final mask of desire, is allowed to pass without grasping. The petals fall, the wind moves through the grass, and it is enough. This world, with all its sorrow, no longer needs to be redeemed. It only needs to be seen as it is. The cries of the child, the fatigue of the old, the loneliness stitched into every celebration each is permitted to be real. Nothing is denied, nothing is corrected. And in that raw, unmodified seeing, what once seemed unbearable becomes soft, not through change, but through truth. There is a calm in knowing the will is no longer in control, a freedom deeper than choice. One breathes not because one decides to, but because breath continues. One weeps, and it is no longer a protest. One smiles, and it is no longer a strategy. The events of life pass through like shadows across the floor of an empty room. They touch, but they do not leave a mark. All that once stood between the self and the world identity, desire, fear, memory dissolves into translucence. The glass through which one saw has shattered. There is no longer observer, and observed. Only the motionless stillness within which all things move. The bird calls, the night falls, the body ages, the soul no longer reacts, it listens. To the world, he appears unchanged. He eats, sleeps, moves through the same spaces, but inwardly nothing adheres. The ego, long revered as captain, is now revealed as ghost. And where once there was tension what to say, what to do, who to be there is now silence, vast and untroubled. This silence is not a vacuum. It is full of what cannot be owned, only witnessed, full of moments that ask for nothing, offer nothing, demand nothing. The ascetic, having renounced desire, does not receive enlightenment. He receives nothing, and in that nothing, he finds rest. Not the rest of sleep, but the rest of no longer climbing, the rest of no longer resisting the river's flow. He becomes the current, the bank, the stone. The question dissolves. The answer fades. What remains is presence not his, not yours, but simply what is. There are no final words, only this breath, and its fading echo. The fire has cooled, the noise has stilled. What was once the self has returned to the silence from which it came. And that silence remains.